Welcome back to Reddit Whispers. My wife cheated while I was deployed overseas. The dust, it had a taste. Gritty, metallic, a constant reminder of where you were. Thousands of miles from anything that felt like home. Anything that felt like her. It coated everything. The inside of your nostrils, the back of your throat, a fine layer on your skin that no amount of scrubbing in the makeshift showers could ever truly wash away. It was the taste of Afghanistan, the taste of deployment. We measured time differently out there, not in days or weeks, but in patrols, in rotations, in the agonizingly slow countdown to R&R. Each sunrise was a victory, each sunset a reprieve. We were a brotherhood forged in boredom and terror, a strange and potent mix that bound us tighter than blood. We knew the cadence of each other's snores, the tales of a brewing anxiety, the exact pitch of a forced laugh that was meant to mask fear. We shared everything, from the last of a care package to the deepest, darkest corners of our minds. It was a strange intimacy, one born of necessity. You had to trust the man next to you with your life, and in turn, you trusted him with your thoughts, your hopes, your whispered confessions in the dead of night when the generators hummed and the silence of the desert pressed in on all sides. My rock in that swirling vortex of sand and uncertainty was the thought of Sarah. Her image was my talisman, my shield against the encroaching madness. I'd conjure her face in the shimmering heat of the day, her laughter in the cacophony of the mess hall, the feel of her hand in mine as I cleaned my rifle for the 10th time. Our love story wasn't some epic romance novel, no grand gestures or dramatic pronouncements. It was built on the small things, the quiet moments that accumulate over time and solidify into something unshakable. Or so I thought. We'd met at a friend's barbecue, a classic, almost cliché beginning. I was home on leave, awkward in my civilian clothes, feeling like a stranger in my own life. She was a whirlwind of bright smiles and easy laughter, a splash of vibrant color in a world that had become muted and drab. She didn't ask me about the things I'd seen, the things I'd done. She asked me about my favorite band, my childhood dog, the stupidest thing I'd ever done for a dare. She saw me, not the uniform, and in that moment, I was lost. Our courtship was a whirlwind of stolen weekends and late-night phone calls, a race against the clock of my next deployment. We crammed a lifetime of getting to know you into a few short months. We fell in love with a fierce and desperate intensity, a love that was amplified by the knowledge that our time together was borrowed. We got married in a small, simple ceremony just before I shipped out. It was impulsive, probably foolish, but it felt right. It felt necessary. We needed that piece of paper, that public declaration, to anchor us to each other across the vast expanse of ocean and desert that would soon separate us. Her letters were my lifeline. They arrived in crumpled, sand-dusted envelopes, carrying the scent of her perfume, a ghost of her presence in that desolate landscape. She wrote about the mundane, the everyday things I longed for with a homesickness that was a physical ache. The leaky faucet she finally fixed, the new coffee shop that opened down the street, the ridiculous antics of our neighbor's cat. She painted a picture of the life that was waiting for me, a life that was real and tangible and so far removed from the surreal existence I was living. I read and reread those letters until the ink began to fade and the paper grew soft and thin. Her words were a balm to my frayed nerves, a reminder of who I was beyond the soldier, beyond the weapon in my hands. I was a husband, I was loved, and that was enough to keep me going. The guys in my unit knew all about Sarah. They'd seen her picture, a smiling, sun-kissed woman with eyes that crinkled at the corners, taped to the inside of my locker. They'd heard me read her letters aloud, my voice thick with a mixture of pride and longing. They ribbed me about it, of course, the way soldiers do, called me a lovesick puppy, a whipped husband. But underneath the banter, there was a current of respect, of envy even. In a place where everything was transient and uncertain, I had something solid, something to hold on to. I had Sarah. Then came the letter from Miller. Miller was a good guy, a solid soldier. We'd been through basic together, a lifetime ago it seemed. He was in a different unit, stationed a few clicks to the south, but we'd managed to stay in touch, a feat in itself in that chaotic environment. His letter started out like any other, The usual mix of complaints about the food, the heat, the mind-numbing boredom. But then, tucked away in the middle of a paragraph, was a sentence that made the blood drain from my face. "Heard your wife is making some new friends back home. Hope everything's all right, man." It was so casual, so offhand, that for a moment I almost missed it. But it was there, a snake coiled in the tall grass, waiting to strike. I read it again, and then a third time, the words blurring in the harsh glare of the desert sun. Making new friends. It was so vague, so open to interpretation. It could mean anything. It could mean nothing. But in the hyper-vigilant, paranoid world of a combat zone, my mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. The seed of doubt had been planted, and in the fertile ground of my fear and isolation, it began to grow. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself that Miller was just repeating some idle gossip, some barracks rumor that had taken on a life of its own. But the thought festered, a poison seeping into my veins. I started rereading Sarah's letters, searching for hidden meanings, for subtle shifts in tone that I might have missed. Her once comforting words now seemed hollow. Her descriptions of her days with friends, once a source of solace, now filled me with a gnawing unease. Who were these friends? Were they new? Were they male? The questions multiplied, each one more venomous than the last. I couldn't ask her, not in a letter that would take weeks to reach her, and whose reply would take just as long to return. The uncertainty was a special kind of torture, a slow, agonizing burn that was in many ways worse than the immediate visceral fear of a firefight. In combat, the enemy was clear, the threat tangible. This was a ghost, a phantom that haunted my waking moments and my fitful, dream-plagued sleep. The bonds of brotherhood, once my source of strength, now felt like a cage. I couldn't confide in the other guys, couldn't voice the ugly, shameful suspicion that was eating me alive. To do so would be to admit a weakness, a vulnerability that had no place in our hyper-masculine world. So I kept it to myself, a toxic secret that I carried with me on every patrol, every mission. The weight of it was heavier than my pack, more suffocating than the body armor I wore in the searing heat. The desert, which had once been a symbol of my separation from her, now felt like a reflection of my own inner landscape, vast, empty, and filled with a terrifying, all-consuming silence. The countdown to my return, once a source of hope, now became a source of dread. What would I find when I finally went home? Would the woman I loved, the woman who was the very center of my universe, be the same person I had left behind? Or would I find a stranger, a woman whose life had moved on without me, leaving me a ghost in my own home? The fear was a cold, hard knot in my stomach, a constant companion that walked with me through the dust and the danger. And as the days crawled by, one indistinguishable from the next, I came to realize a terrible, chilling truth. The war I was fighting in the mountains of Afghanistan was nothing compared to the war that was raging within my own heart. The betrayal of a loved one, I was beginning to understand, could inflict wounds far deeper and more lasting than any enemy bullet. And for the first time in my life, I was truly, utterly, and completely terrified. I started to notice things, or maybe I was just looking for them. Confirmation bias in full effect. A slight hesitation in her voice during our rare, crackly satellite phone calls. A new friend's name mentioned a little too often in her letters. Little things, insignificant on their own, but when pieced together, they formed a mosaic of doubt and suspicion. My mind became a detective's office, my heart a courtroom where my wife was on trial, and I was both judge and jury. It was a descent into a personal hell, a self-inflicted wound that I couldn't stop picking at. The camaraderie of my unit, once a source of comfort, now felt like a spotlight on my private agony. I'd see the other guys laughing at a joke, sharing stories of their wives and girlfriends, and a bitter, resentful jealousy would rise in my throat. They were so blissfully ignorant, so confident in the love that was waiting for them back home. Or were they? How many of them were carrying the same secret, the same gnawing fear? We never spoke of it, of course. It was an unspoken rule, a taboo that was more sacred than any military regulation. To admit that your woman might be unfaithful was to admit that you were not man enough to keep her, that you had failed in the most fundamental way. So we suffered in silence, a silent epidemic of heartbreak and betrayal that was as much a part of the deployment experience as the sand and the sun. I began to withdraw, to retreat into myself. The easy banter and horseplay of the barracks became an irritant, a grating reminder of a life that felt increasingly out of reach. I spent my downtime alone, cleaning my weapon with a meticulous, obsessive focus, the repetitive motion a small, temporary distraction from the storm that was raging in my head. My squad leader noticed the change, of course. He was a seasoned NCO, a man who had seen it all, and he knew the signs of a soldier who was starting to unravel. He pulled me aside one day, his face a mixture of concern and a weary, world-worn sadness. "What's going on, son?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. "You're not yourself." I wanted to tell him, to pour out the whole sordid, pathetic story, but the words wouldn't come. They were trapped in my throat, a hard, painful lump of shame and fear. So I did what soldiers do. I lied. "I'm fine, Sergeant," I said, my voice flat and emotionless, "just tired." He didn't press the issue, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe me. He just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the things we couldn't say, the burdens we had to carry alone. And in that moment, I had never felt more alone in my life. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. The end of my tour was in sight, a shimmering mirage on the horizon. But instead of relief, all I felt was a cold, creeping dread. The homecoming that I had once dreamed of, the moment I had replayed in my mind 1,000 times, was now a source of terror. What if she wasn't there to meet me? What if she was, but her eyes were filled with guilt and pity? The what-ifs were a relentless assault on my already fragile psyche. They were my constant companions on patrol, my unwelcome bunkmates in the dead of night. They were the ghosts that haunted the edges of my vision, the whispers that I heard in the wind that howled through the mountain passes. The war had taken so much from me, from all of us. It had stolen our youth, our innocence, our peace of mind. But I was beginning to fear that it had taken something even more precious, something that I could never get back. It had stolen my future. It had stolen my Sarah. And as the day of my departure finally dawned, I found myself praying for a delay, for a sandstorm, for anything that would keep me in that God-forsaken desert a little longer. Because as much as I hated that place, as much as I longed for the green grass and the blue skies of home, I was more afraid of the truth that was waiting for me there than I was of any enemy I had faced on the battlefield. The betrayal of a wife, I was learning, was a weapon that could cut a man down to his very soul. And I had a terrible sinking feeling that I was about to become its next casualty. The flight home was a blur of exhaustion and anxiety. The other guys were jubilant, their laughter and a palpable sense of relief filling the cavernous interior of the C-130. They were going home to their wives, their girlfriends, their children. They were going home to the lives they had left behind. I, on the other hand, felt like I was flying towards my own execution. The closer we got to American soil, the tighter the knot in my stomach became. I tried to sleep, but my mind was a racetrack of worst-case scenarios, each one more vivid and more painful than the last. When we finally landed, the wave of cheers and applause erupted from the soldiers on board. For them, the war was over. For me, it felt like it was just beginning. The reunion was a chaotic scene of tears and laughter, of long-awaited embraces, and a joy so pure and so powerful that it was almost overwhelming. I scanned the crowd, my heart pounding in my chest, searching for her face. And then I saw her. She was standing a little apart from the other families, a small, hesitant smile on her lips. She was even more beautiful than I remembered, a fragile, delicate flower in a sea of uniforms and camouflage. But there was something different in her eyes, something I couldn't quite decipher, a sadness, a guilt, a distance that hadn't been there before. When our eyes finally met, her smile faltered for a moment, and in that fleeting instant, I knew. I knew that my worst fears were not just the product of a paranoid, war-weary mind. They were real. And they were standing right in front of me, in the form of the woman I loved more than life itself. The walk across the tarmac felt like a mile. With every step, the distance between us seemed to grow, the chasm of her betrayal widening until it was a vast, unbridgeable gulf. When I finally reached her, I didn't know what to do, what to say. The embrace that I had dreamed of for so long was awkward and stiff, a hollow imitation of the passion and the love that had once been the very foundation of my world. "Welcome home," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engines and the happy cries of the other families. But her words were a lie. I wasn't home. I was in a strange, new, and terrifying place. A place where the woman I had trusted with my heart and my soul was a stranger, and the life I had fought so hard to return to was nothing more than a pile of ashes. The war in Afghanistan was over for me, but the battle for my own survival, for my own sanity, had just begun. And as I looked into the eyes of the woman who had shattered my world, I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and as hard as the steel of my rifle, that this was a war I was going to have to fight alone. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I had the strength to win. My wife cheated while I was deployed overseas. The drive from the base was a silent, suffocating affair. The familiar landscape of home, the green trees and the manicured lawns, seemed alien and distorted, as if I was looking at them through a warped and twisted lens. Sarah sat beside me, a stranger in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The silence between us was a living, breathing thing, a heavy, oppressive presence that filled the small space of the car. It was a silence that was pregnant with unspoken words, with accusations and denials, with a grief that was so profound and so overwhelming that it was a physical weight on my chest. I wanted to scream, to rage, to demand an explanation, but the words were stuck in my throat, choked by a toxic mix of anger and a heartbreak so profound it felt like a physical wound. What could I say? What could she say? The truth was a landmine that lay between us, and we were both too afraid to take the step that would detonate it, that would blow our world, our marriage, our lives into a million irreparable pieces. When we finally arrived at our house, the home that I had dreamed of for so long, it felt like a museum, a collection of artifacts from a life that was no longer mine. Her touch was everywhere, in the new throw pillows on the couch, the framed pictures on the walls, the scent of her perfume that lingered in the air. But it was a ghost's touch, a reminder of a life that had moved on without me, a life in which I was now a stranger, an intruder. The first few days were a strange and surreal dance of avoidance. We moved around each other like two magnets with the same polarity, repelling each other with an invisible but powerful force. We spoke in polite, clipped sentences, our conversations limited to the mundane and the trivial. "Did you sleep well? Do you want some coffee? I'm going to run some errands." It was a farce, a pathetic attempt to maintain a semblance of normalcy in a world that had been turned completely upside down. But underneath the surface of our carefully constructed civility, the truth simmered, a poison that was slowly and inexorably seeping into every corner of our lives. I found myself watching her, studying her, searching for clues, for evidence of her betrayal. I'd catch her on the phone, her voice low and hushed, and a cold, sick feeling would wash over me. I'd see a name on her phone, a name I didn't recognize, and the questions would start all over again, a relentless, torturous cycle of suspicion and doubt. I was a ghost in my own home, a phantom that haunted the hallways and the rooms that had once been my sanctuary. I'd lie in bed at night, inches away from her, and feel a chasm of 1,000 miles between us. I could hear her breathing, feel the warmth of her body next to mine, but she was a stranger, an enigma, a woman who held the key to my happiness and my despair in the palm of her hand. The nights were the worst. The darkness offered no escape, no reprieve from the demons that tormented me. The images would come unbidden, vivid and brutal, of her with another man, in our bed, in our home, in the life that we had built together. The jealousy was a physical thing, a hot, searing pain that coursed through my veins, a rage that was so intense and so primal that it terrified me. I had faced death in the mountains of Afghanistan, had looked into the eyes of the enemy and had not flinched. But this was a different kind of war, a war against an enemy that was inside me, a war that was being fought on the battlefield of my own heart. And it was a war that I was losing. My homecoming, which should have been a time of joy and celebration, became a descent into a private hell. The well-meaning questions of friends and family, "How does it feel to be back? Are you so happy to be home?" were like daggers in my heart. How could I explain to them that the home I had returned to was not a sanctuary, but a prison? How could I tell them that the woman they saw as a loving, devoted wife was a stranger to me, a woman whose betrayal had shattered my world? So I lied. I smiled and nodded and played the part of the returning hero, the grateful husband, the happy man. But it was a performance, a mask that I wore to hide the raw, gaping wound that was festering underneath. The truth was that I was not a hero. I was a casualty of a different kind of war, a war that was fought not with guns and bombs, but with lies and deceit. And the wounds of this war were invisible, but they were no less devastating. They were the wounds of a broken heart, a shattered trust, a love that had been betrayed. And as the days turned into weeks, I came to realize a terrible, chilling truth. Some wounds never heal. Some scars last a lifetime. And the scar that Sarah had carved into my soul was one that I would carry with me forever. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, a day as gray and as bleak as my own inner landscape. I was rummaging through a drawer looking for a pair of socks when my hand brushed against a small leather-bound book. It was her journal. I knew I shouldn't have opened it. I knew that it was a violation of her privacy, a betrayal of the trust that was already in tatters. But I was a desperate man, a drowning man, and her journal was a life raft, a chance to finally know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. I sat on the edge of the bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and I began to read. And with every word, every sentence, every page, the world that I had known, the love that I had cherished, the woman that I had adored, was systematically and brutally dismantled. The journal was a chronicle of her betrayal, a detailed account of her affair with a man from her work, a man whose name I had heard her mention in passing, a man who had been a ghost in the background of our lives and who was now the star of my own personal horror movie. She wrote of their secret lunches, their late-night phone calls, their stolen moments in the parking lot after work. She wrote of the thrill of the forbidden, the excitement of the new, the intoxicating feeling of being desired by someone else. She wrote of the guilt, the shame, the fear of being caught. But she also wrote of the love, the passion, the connection that she had found with this other man, a connection that she said she had lost with me. As I read her words, a cold, numb feeling spread through me. The anger and the jealousy were gone, replaced by a profound and all-consuming sadness. It was the sadness of a man who had lost everything, a man who had been stripped bare, a man who had been betrayed in the most intimate and devastating way possible. I read until the very last page, until the very last entry, which was dated just 2 days before my return. "He's coming home," she had written, "and I don't know what to do. I love him, I do, but I'm not sure if I'm in love with him anymore. And I'm in love with Michael. God help me, I'm in love, Michael." I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The room was silent, save for the sound of the rain drumming against the window pane. And in that silence, I felt something shift within me, something break. The man who had gone to war, the man who had come back hoping to pick up the pieces of his life, was gone.
In his place was a stranger, a hollowed-out shell of a man who had been broken by a war that he had never even fought. I walked out of the bedroom, the journal clutched in my hand, and I went to find my wife. It was time for the war to finally come to an end. It was time for the truth to finally be told. And as I walked down the stairs, I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and as final as the grave, that my life would never, ever be the same. The confrontation was not the explosive, dramatic scene that I had imagined. There was no shouting, no screaming, no throwing of plates. It was a quiet, almost surgical affair. I found her in the kitchen, staring out at the rain-swept garden, a cup of tea held loosely in her hands. I placed the journal on the table between us, a silent, damning indictment of her betrayal. She looked at it, her face draining of all color. And then she looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a strange, almost defiant resignation. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But the words were meaningless, hollow. They were a pebble thrown into a vast, bottomless ocean of pain. "Why?" I asked, my own voice a stranger's, flat and devoid of any emotion. It was the only question that mattered, the only question that I needed an answer to. And so she told me. She told me of the loneliness, the fear, the resentment that had festered in my absence. She told me of the weight of being a military wife, the constant worry, the endless nights alone. She told me of how she had felt neglected, forgotten, a supporting character in the grand drama of my life. And she told me of Michael, of how he had made her feel seen, heard, desired, how he had filled the void that I had left behind. I listened to her words, a silent, impassive judge. And as she spoke, I felt a strange and unexpected emotion begin to surface: pity. I pitied her for her weakness, for her inability to weather the storm that we had both agreed to face. I pitied her for the choices she had made, for the happiness she had thrown away. But most of all, I pitied her because I knew, with a certainty that was bone deep, that she had lost something far more valuable than a husband. She had lost herself. When she had finished, the silence returned, heavier and more oppressive than before. The rain had stopped, and the late afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, casting long, mournful shadows across the kitchen floor. "I want a divorce," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of the end of an era. She didn't argue, didn't protest. She just nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her pale cheek. And in that moment, I saw her not as a monster, not as a villain, but as a casualty, another victim of a war that had claimed so much, a war that had reached across oceans and continents to destroy the very thing that I had been fighting to protect: my home, my marriage, my love. The days that followed were a blur of lawyers and paperwork, of dividing up a life that had once been so intricately and so irrevocably intertwined. We were two strangers living under the same roof, two ghosts haunting the ruins of a once happy home. And then, one day, she was gone. She packed her bags, said her goodbyes, and walked out of my life forever. The silence she left behind was a deafening roar, a constant screaming reminder of all that I had lost. The war was over. The enemy had been vanquished, but there were no victory parades, no medals of honor. There was only the quiet, desolate landscape of a broken heart and the long, lonely road to a future that I could no longer imagine. The war had taken my innocence, my peace of mind, my ability to trust, but it had also given me something, a strength I never knew I possessed, a resilience that had been forged in the crucible of heartbreak and betrayal. And as I stood in the empty house, the house that was no longer a home, I knew that I would survive. I had survived the war in Afghanistan, and I would survive this war too. But I would be forever changed, forever scarred, by the battle that had been waged not on a foreign battlefield, but in the deepest, most vulnerable corners of my own heart. The war at home, I had learned, was the deadliest war of all, and its casualties were the ones who were left behind, the ones who had to pick up the pieces of a life that had been shattered by a betrayal that was more devastating than any bomb, more destructive than any bullet. It was a lesson that I would carry with me for the rest of my days, a lesson that had been paid for in the currency of a broken heart and a love that was lost forever. My wife cheated while I was deployed overseas. The emptiness of the house was a physical presence, a constant suffocating weight. Every room echoed with the ghost of her laughter. Every corner held a memory that was now tainted, poisoned by the knowledge of her betrayal. I found myself wandering through the silent rooms like a lost soul, a soldier without a war to fight, a husband without a wife to come home to. The homecoming that I had envisioned, the one that had sustained me through the long, lonely months of deployment, was a cruel joke, a fantasy that had been shattered into a million pieces. The reality was a stark and brutal landscape of heartbreak and loneliness. I tried to fill the silence, to drown out the memories. I blasted music, left the television on all day, invited friends over for boisterous, beer-fueled gatherings that were a hollow imitation of camaraderie. But the silence always returned, a patient, persistent predator that waited for the noise to die down, for the friends to go home, for the alcohol to wear off. And in the dead of night, when the house was finally still, the silence would descend, and the memories would come, unbidden and unwelcome, to torment me. I saw her everywhere, in the grocery store, in the park, in the faces of strangers. Every woman with her hair color, with her smile, with her laugh, was a dagger in my heart. The world, which had once been a place of shared experiences and a future that we were building together, was now a minefield of painful reminders. I became a recluse, a hermit in my own home. I avoided the places we used to go, the restaurants we used to frequent, the friends we used to share. To see them, to talk to them, would be to open a wound that was still raw and gaping. So I cut myself off. I isolated myself. I built a wall around my heart that was higher and more impenetrable than any fortress I had ever seen in a combat zone. My days became a monotonous cycle of waking, eating, and sleeping. I was a man on autopilot, a machine that was going through the motions of life but was dead on the inside. The vibrant, confident man who had gone to war had been replaced by a ghost, a shadow of his former self. The war had changed me, of course. It had hardened me, had made me more cynical, more world-weary.
But it was her betrayal that had truly broken me. It had shattered my ability to trust, my belief in the goodness of people, my faith in the very concept of love. Love, I now realized, was a battlefield, and I was one of its many casualties. I was a prisoner of war, captured not by an enemy soldier, but by the memory of a love that had been a lie. And the prison was not a cell of steel and concrete, but a cage of my own making, a prison of my own grief and despair. The divorce was a cold, impersonal affair, a series of meetings with lawyers who spoke in a language that I didn't understand, a language of assets and liabilities, of spousal support and the division of property. Our life together was reduced to a series of numbers on a balance sheet, a cold, hard calculation of who got what. I didn't fight her on any of it. I didn't have the strength, the will, the desire. I just wanted it to be over. I wanted to close this chapter of my life, to tear it out of the book and burn it to ashes. So I signed the papers. I agreed to her terms. I gave her everything she wanted. The house, the car, the money. It was all meaningless to me now. They were just things, hollow symbols of a life that was no longer mine. The only thing I wanted, the only thing I couldn't have, was my old life back. The life before the war, before the betrayal, before the heartbreak. The life when I was a happy man, a man who was in love, a man who had a future. But that life was gone, and it was never coming back.
And as I walked out of the lawyer's office, a free man in the eyes of the law, I had never felt more like a prisoner in my life. The days that followed were a descent into a darkness that was deeper and more profound than anything I had ever experienced. The grief was a physical thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket that I couldn't shake off. It was in my bones, in my blood, in the very air that I breathed. I stopped eating, I stopped sleeping, I stopped caring. I was a ship without a rudder, adrift on a sea of despair, with no land in sight. I started drinking, a bottle of whiskey my only companion in the long, lonely nights. The alcohol offered a temporary escape, a brief respite from the pain. But it was a false friend, a siren that lured me closer to the rocks of self-destruction. And in the morning, when the effects of the alcohol had worn off, the pain would return, sharper and more intense than before. I was a man on a downward spiral, and I was falling fast. My friends, the guys from my unit, tried to help. They called, they texted, they showed up at my door with 6 packs of beer and words of encouragement. But I pushed them away. I didn't want their pity, their sympathy, their well-meaning advice. They couldn't understand what I was going through. They hadn't walked in my shoes, hadn't felt the sting of a betrayal that was so deep and so personal that it had poisoned my very soul. They were still living in a world of happy endings, of faithful wives and loving families. And I was an outsider, an exile, a man who had been cast out of that world, a man who was now living in a different reality, a reality of broken promises and shattered dreams. The breaking point came on a cold, starless night, a night that was as dark and as empty as my own heart. I was sitting in the dark, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in my hand, the silence of the empty house pressing in on me from all sides. And in that moment, in that abyss of despair, a thought entered my mind, a thought that was as seductive as it was terrifying, the thought of ending it all, the thought of finally escaping the pain, the loneliness, the emptiness, the thought of peace. I got up, my movements slow and deliberate, and I went to the gun safe in my closet. I took out my service pistol, the one that had been my constant companion in the war, the one that had saved my life on more than one occasion. I held it in my hand, the cold, hard steel a stark contrast to the turmoil that was raging within me. I sat on the edge of the bed, the gun in my lap, and I thought about Sarah. I thought about the good times, the laughter, the love, and I thought about the betrayal, the lies, the pain. And as I sat there, in the darkness, on the brink of oblivion, something happened. A memory surfaced, a memory from the war, a memory that I had buried deep within the recesses of my mind. It was a memory of a young boy, an Afghan boy, whose village had been caught in the crossfire of a battle between our forces and the Taliban.
His family had been killed, his home destroyed, his world turned upside down. And yet, when we found him, amidst the rubble and the carnage, he was not crying. He was not screaming. He was sitting on a pile of rocks, his face streaked with dirt and tears, and he was singing. He was singing a song of hope, a song of resilience, a song of the enduring power of the human spirit. And as I sat there, in the darkness of my own personal war zone, I remembered that boy, and I remembered his song. And for the first time in a long time, I began to cry. I cried for the man I had been, for the love I had lost, for the future that had been stolen from me. I cried for the pain, the loneliness, the despair. I cried until I had no more tears left to cry. And when the tears were gone, a strange sense of calm washed over me. The darkness had not disappeared, but it was no longer all-consuming. The pain was still there, but it was no longer a dagger in my heart. It was a scar, a reminder of a battle that I had fought and survived. I put the gun back in the safe, and I went to the window. The first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. A new day was beginning. And as I stood there, watching the sun rise, I made a promise to myself. I promised myself that I would not be a casualty of this war.
I would not let her betrayal define me, destroy me, defeat me. I would honor the memory of that young boy, and I would sing my own song of hope, of resilience, of survival. The road ahead would be long and difficult. The scars would always be there, a reminder of the battle I had fought. But I was a soldier. I was a survivor, and I would not surrender. I would not be defeated. I would live, and I would find a way to be happy again. The war at home had taken so much from me, but it had not taken my spirit. It had not taken my will to live. And as I watched the new day dawn, I knew, with a certainty that was as bright and as hopeful as the rising sun, that my war was finally over, and I had won. My wife cheated while I was deployed overseas. The decision to live, to truly live, was not a sudden dramatic epiphany. It was a slow, arduous process, a series of small, faltering steps in the right direction. It was a conscious choice that I had to make every single day, every single hour, every single minute. It was a war of attrition, a battle against the ghosts of the past, a fight for a future that I was not yet sure I deserved.
The first step was to get help. I'd been raised in a culture of stoicism, a world where men were taught to bottle up their emotions, to suffer in silence, to man up. But I was beginning to realize that there was no shame in admitting that I was broken, that I was in pain, that I needed help. So I made a phone call. I called the VA and I made an appointment with a therapist. The first session was awkward and difficult. I sat across from a kind, middle-aged woman with gentle eyes and a patient smile, and I struggled to find the words to describe the chaos that was raging within me. But she was a good listener, and she created a safe space for me to finally open up, to finally give voice to the pain and the anger and the grief that I had been carrying for so long. We talked about the war, about the things I had seen and done, about the guilt and the trauma that I had brought back with me. And we talked about Sarah, about the betrayal, about the heartbreak, about the shattered trust. And as I talked, I felt a weight begin to lift from my shoulders, a weight that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The therapy was not a magic cure. It was a long and painful process of confronting my demons, of facing my fears, of learning to live with the scars that would always be a part of me. There were days when I wanted to quit, to retreat back into the darkness, to surrender to the despair. But I kept going back. I kept talking, I kept listening, I kept learning. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, I began to heal. The second step was to reconnect with the world. I had isolated myself, had cut myself off from the people who cared about me. And I knew that if I was going to survive, I couldn't do it alone. So I started reaching out. I called my friends, the guys from my unit, and I apologized for pushing them away. And they, in their own gruff, unspoken way, welcomed me back into the fold. We started hanging out again, not in the forced, boisterous way that I had tried before, but in a quiet, comfortable camaraderie that was a balm to my wounded soul. We'd go fishing or hiking or just sit around a bonfire, drinking beer and talking about everything and nothing. They didn't treat me like a victim, like a fragile, broken man. They treated me like one of their own, a brother in arms, a fellow survivor. And in their company, I began to feel like myself again, the man I had been before the war, before the betrayal. I also started to reconnect with my family. I had been avoiding their calls, their worried questions, their well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful advice. But I realized that they were a part of my support system, a foundation that I could lean on when I felt like I was about to crumble. So I went home. I went back to the small town where I had grown up, to the familiar faces and the confident rhythms of a life that was simpler, slower, and more real than the chaotic, transient world of the military. I spent time with my parents, with my siblings, with my nieces and nephews. I let them love me. I let them care for me. I let them remind me of who I was before I was a soldier, before I was a husband, before I was a man who had been broken by a war that he had fought on two fronts. And in their love and their unwavering support, I found a strength that I never knew I possessed. The third step, and in many ways the most difficult, was to forgive. I had been consumed by anger, by bitterness, by a desire for revenge.
But I was beginning to realize that the anger was a poison, and it was destroying me, not her. Forgiving her was not about letting her off the hook, about condoning her actions, about saying that what she did was okay. It was about letting go of the anger, the bitterness, the resentment. It was about freeing myself from the prison of the past. It was about choosing to move forward, to not let her betrayal define the rest of my life. It was a long and difficult process. There were days when the anger would come roaring back, a tidal wave of rage that threatened to drown me. But I would go back to my therapist, I would talk to my friends, I would lean on my family. And slowly, day by day, the anger began to subside. It was replaced by a quiet, sad acceptance. I accepted that she was not the person I thought she was. I accepted that our love was not the epic, unbreakable bond that I had believed it to be. I accepted that our marriage was over. And in that acceptance, I found a strange and unexpected peace. I also had to learn to forgive myself. I had been tormented by guilt, by the feeling that I was somehow responsible for her betrayal. I had been away for so long, had been so focused on the war, on my own survival, that I had neglected her, had taken her for granted. But I was beginning to realize that her choices were her own. I was not responsible for her actions. I was not to blame for her betrayal. And in forgiving myself, I was finally able to let go of the guilt, the shame, the self-recrimination.
I was finally able to see myself not as a failure, but as a survivor. The final step was to create a new life for myself, a life that was not defined by the past, but by the future. I had been a soldier for so long, it was the only identity I had ever known. But I was no longer a soldier. I was a civilian, a man with a blank slate, a man with the freedom to choose his own path. I went back to school, I got a degree, I found a job that I was passionate about. I started to build a new life for myself, a life that was based on my own interests, my own passions, my own dreams. I also started to date again. It was terrifying at first. The scars of my past were still raw, and the fear of being hurt again was a constant companion. But I knew that if I was going to be truly happy, I had to be open to the possibility of love again. And so I took a chance. I met a woman who was kind and funny and intelligent, a woman who saw me for who I was, not for what I had been through. And in her, I found a love that was different from the love I had known with Sarah. It was a quieter, more mature love, a love that was built on a foundation of trust and respect and a shared understanding of the fragility and the preciousness of life. It was a love that healed. It has been years now since the war, since the betrayal, since the divorce. The scars are still there, a faint, silvery reminder of the battles I have fought. But they no longer hurt. They are a part of me, a part of my story, a testament to my resilience, to my strength, to my ability to survive. I am not the same man I was before the war. I am older, wiser, more compassionate. I have learned that life is not a fairy tale, that love is not always a happy ending. But I have also learned that the human spirit is a powerful and resilient thing. I have learned that even in the darkest of nights, there is always the promise of a new day. And I have learned that the greatest victory is not the one that is won on the battlefield, but the one that is won in the quiet, desolate landscape of a broken heart. The war at home was the deadliest war I ever fought, but it was also the war that made me the man I am today. And for that, in a strange and unexpected way, I am grateful. I am a survivor. I am a warrior. And I am finally, truly, and completely at peace. If you've made it this far, I'd love to hear from you what moment in your life made you see someone for who they truly were. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to Reddit Whispers, where the real stories get told.